はい、それではお時間になりましたので、本日ですね、ハル大学で、国際関係論を学ぶというテーマでですね、ハル大学の方にお越しいただいております。本日はですね、ドクター・ジャスティン・モリスさんで、ハル大学のインターナショナルオフィスの方からアリックスさんにお越しいただいております。また、在校生の方で、東邦子さんにお越しいただいておりまして、それぞれの方からプレゼンテーションをしていただく予定でございます。本日ですね、プレゼンテーション終わりましたら、終わりまして、もし時間が余ってたらですね、質問のお時間を設けておりますので、質問させていただきたいと思います。もしプレゼンテーションの最中ですね、ご質問等ありましたら、チャットボックスの方からご質問をしていただくようにお願いいたします。また、本日のウェビナーではですね、YouTube での同時配信になっておりますので、皆様のマイクとカメラは、常にミュートにさせていただいておりますので、発言等がちょっとできない形にはなるんですけれども、よろしくお願いいたします。もし質問等ありましたら、お気軽に、チャットボックスの方から、ご投稿していただけたらと思います。はい。それではですね、ウェビナーを開始していきたいと思います。So, Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hiroshi. Good morning, everybody. My name's Alex. I'm an international recruitment officer at the University of Hull, and we're currently having a lovely summer's day in the city. So today's presentation is about politics and international relations at the University of Hull, and I'm really glad to have two people with me. One of them is Dr. Justin Morris, who will take over very soon, and he's going to do a really great presentation for us about the subject of politics and international relations at the University of Hull. And I'm also joined today by Kaniko, who is a current postgraduate student ambassador at the University of Hull. Following Justin's presentation, I myself will then pop up and give you a bit of information about the courses that you can study that are related to politics and international relations at the University of Hull, what the entry requirements are for those, and about our tuition fee policy as well. And I'll then hand on to Kaniko, who will give you a really good student's perspective of her time at the University of Hull. But for now, I will put myself on mute, and I'm going to hand on to Dr. Justin Morris to do his presentation for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning from sunny Hull. Good evening to all of you in Japan. As Alex said, my name's Dr. Justin Morris. I'm a senior lecturer in the politics department at the University of Hull, and I also look after undergraduate admissions. But today I'm going to talk to you about international politics and the difference between international politics and domestic politics. So I'll switch to screen share, and hopefully you will be seeing my presentation. So the first thing I would say about politics full stop is that it is about power. If you're interested in politics, you are interested in power. We're interested in who and what has power. We're interested in the forms that power can take. We're interested in how people use and abuse power, whether it can be constrained, whether it's shifting. These are all the big kind of power questions that we're interested in if we're interested in politics across the board. But international politics, or in international politics, power takes on a somewhat different role and a different form. And I want to try to explain that to you today. And I want to do so by focusing on one of the crises that we're currently facing in the world, and that is the conflict in Ukraine, because I thought that would be a topical issue, but also because it demonstrates the points I'm making, I think, nice and clearly. So just to come back to this PowerPoint first, and the idea that we're all interested in power. So that picture is of the members of the School of Politics and International Studies at Hull. And just to very briefly illustrate what I mean about our interest in power, I'm going to take two members of the school. So this gentleman here, an extremely esteemed scholar, is Professor the Lord Norton of Louth. And Lord Norton is interested in Parliament and legislatures and the kind of minutiae of how laws come into being within any given country. Over here is Dr. David Lonsdale. And Dr. Lonsdale is interested in nuclear weapons, nuclear targeting, nuclear deterrence, issues incidentally which I think are going to become increasingly prominent in Japanese politics in the coming years. But nuclear weapons, legislative processes. What possibly can tie those things together? And the answer is, as I've already alluded to, power. Lord Norton is interested in the power relationships between the executive, the parliament, the media, the electorate, and so on. Dr. Lonsdale is interested in a very different type of power. He's interested in power in the form of, as I say, nuclear and also conventional weapons. So power is at the heart of everything that we're interested in discussing. Now, on the international relations side, and here I use the term very broadly, so I'm also including international political economy. I'm interested in war studies, security studies, so a very broad approach I'm taking when I use the term power. We can see the colleagues that are involved in that within the department. And we're interested in international politics, as I say, as opposed to domestic politics. So what's the difference? Well, the first thing to say is that to understand the difference between the way that power operates in international politics and domestic politics, we have to look at the structures within which politics at those two levels is conducted. And without getting too technical here, what we're distinguishing between is domestic politics, which is conducted in what we refer to as a hierarchical structure, and international politics, politics between states, which is a slightly crude definition, but it will work for our purposes for now. International politics, where the structure is what we call anarchical. So that's the first distinction, hierarchy and anarchy. Let me explain what I mean by those two terms. So, hierarchy in domestic politics. We talk about domestic politics being hierarchical because the state sits above the citizens. Whether it's here in the UK or whether it's where many of the audience are today in Japan, the state sits above us. It sits above us in the sense that it has not just the power, but the authority to legislate over us. It can pass laws which we are legally obliged to obey. It can tax us. It can levy income tax, other forms of tax upon the money we earn, the goods we purchase, and so on. In extreme cases, the state has the authority to imprison citizens. People who break the rules are subject to the authority of the state, and possibly they may end up in or subject to some kind of sanction, imprisonment, a fine, whatever it may be. So that's the sense in which the state sits in a hierarchical position. It sits above us. It is entitled to do these things, and this is really important. It's not just that the state has the power to do the things I've just referred to there, legislate, tax, imprison, and so on. It's that it has the authority to do that. It has the rightful power, if you like, to do that. In international politics, things are somewhat different. And they're different because states are sovereign. More importantly, in the terms of this discussion, they are sovereign equals. In formal terms, and I stress the word formally, for reasons that will become obvious as we progress through the talk, states are all equal. nobody sits above the state. Nobody's entitled to legislate over states, to tax a state, or to try or punish a state. Formally, the United States, which I'm representing here with a picture of the Capitol building, is equal to, and if we had a live audience here, I'd say, does anybody know which Parliament building this is? That is the Parliament building of Tuvalu, a sovereign state, but a tiny, tiny state. We all know that Tuvalu is nowhere near as powerful as the United States of America. It's absolutely dwarfed by the United States of America in terms of power, but formally, the two countries are equal. Okay, so that's the first idea, that in a hierarchical relationship, you've got a state which stands above the citizens. But in international politics, because all the states are sovereign, they are equal, nobody, at least formally, or nothing formally, sits above them. So, what are the implications of that? Well, the implications of that is that power takes on greater significance in international politics. And we say this because in international politics, whilst no actor has the authority to tell another state what to do, it doesn't follow from that no state has the power to force or to tell another state what to do. To go back to my rather extreme examples of the United States of America, the most powerful state in the world, I would argue to this day, including China, so the most powerful state in the world. And Tuvalu, one of the smallest, least powerful states in the world, they are formally equal, but we know that should it choose to do so, the United States can put huge pressure on smaller countries, less powerful countries. In other words, it can exercise power over them. And of course, it's not just the United States that's a hugely powerful state. I would say it's the most powerful, but there are other countries in the world which also are unusually powerful. China would be an obvious example. In economic terms, Japan would be an example. Russia, as we're currently seeing, and I'll come back to this and say a little bit more in a minute, is a very powerful military state, though not necessarily powerful in other areas. So we know that some states are hugely more powerful than others. And we refer to these states as the great powers. And the great powers, despite this idea that formally everybody's equal, this small number of states, the great powers, are particularly significant in international politics. Now, the reason that this can sometimes become highly problematic is that the power that ultimately can be resorted to in international politics is military power. Now, it's been quite fashionable of late to suggest that certainly within large swathes of the world, military power has become a less significant factor. I've often been told when I've given talks like this that it harks back to a time that's somewhat gone, that states don't resolve their differences through military power. But the point was never that states always resorted to military power. We know that it's rare that they do so. The point, though, is that states can, or some states can, resort to military power. It was always a possibility. It wasn't particularly likely, but it was always possible that military power could be brought to bear in extreme situations. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates that with devastating impact. So we've got this idea of anarchy as opposed to hierarchy, the idea that as a consequence of anarchy, power is particularly important in international politics, and in particular, that military power can be particularly important. So that's the framework in which I want us to move on and think, okay, so what is it about great powers? Why do we concentrate on those states? Now, I'm not going to read that long quote out, but that's a quote from a book which certainly in international relations circles is quite famous. It was published in 1944, so a long while ago. And it was written by a scholar called William Fox, and Fox was the person who coined the term superpower. Prior to Fox's book, people would talk about great powers, but Fox said that there are some states in the world that are so powerful. He was thinking at the time about the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, because obviously he's writing just toward the end of the Second World War, that these states should be called superpowers. And the thrust of Fox's book is to say, look, whether we like it or not, we need to recognize that some states are more powerful than others. So Fox uses the slightly unusual analogy between elephants and squirrels. He says this book is about high politics of the post-war world. It pays particular attention to the elephants, but not because they have a moral right to exist and do as they please, which is superior to the moral rights of the squirrels to do the same. It's not about morality, he says, it's about reality. We cannot ignore the difference between the elephants on the one hand and the squirrels on the other, of the great powers on the one hand and the less powerful states on the other. We might not like the fact that we have to differentiate, but we do nevertheless have to differentiate. That's effectively what Fox is telling us. So what does it mean? What are we talking about when we talk about great powers? Well, this is a huge question. I could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I won't because I've only got a relatively short period of time today. So there's an argument about what makes a state a great power. Essentially, there's agreement that to be a great power, a state has to be in, to use Hedley Bull's term, the front rank of military capability. So military power is hugely important. That has to be backed by economic power, because otherwise, obviously, your military power will collapse. But there's also a question, and this is where there's a much greater debate, which I don't have time to get into today, as to whether or not great powers, superpowers, must also be socially recognized. In other words, other states, the less powerful states in the world, should see that the great powers are somehow different and have to be thought about in different ways to other states, the more normal states, if you want to put it in those terms. But the fact that these great powers do exist, however we might debate about the definition of what constitutes a great power, it still leaves questions that we need to ask. We need to think, for example, about what great powers do, and sometimes what they don't do, because sometimes we might want the great powers to act when they choose not to. What they can or could do, in other words, the potential that they have to act and intervene, and what we think they should and shouldn't do. Certainly the narrative in the West, and I think more generally around the world, is that Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. There's a debate over to the extent to which countries such as the United States or China should become involved in that crisis to try and bring about a resolution of it. So we know that politics is often played out by asking questions about great powers, what they do and don't do, what they could or can and could do, what they should and shouldn't do. These are all questions which we tend to ask, particularly of the great powers, when a crisis in international politics occurs. So I want to focus in for the last kind of 10 minutes or so of my talk on the particular case of Ukraine and hopefully illustrate the point I was making there about how we try to understand what great powers can do, could do, should do, shouldn't do, and so on. So I've kind of split the argument here into what I'm referring to as two narratives, a narrative of principle and a narrative of power pragmatism. Now, I should say at the outset that I've set this dichotomy up to be unrealistically stark, really, just to make my argument hopefully clear. In practice, what tends to happen is we need to merge questions of principle and pragmatism, because actually the distinction between them isn't anything like as stark as I'm suggesting here, but I'm using it just as a way to convey my argument. So let me look first at my principle narrative. So the principle narrative, which is the narrative which I think is dominant certainly in the European Union, amongst NATO member states, allies of the United States, and so on, that principle narrative would run something like this. It would say Ukraine is a sovereign, independent state. As such, it has the right to determine its own future. It's not up to Russia what Ukraine does. It's up to Ukraine what Ukraine does. So that's the first point of principle, that Ukraine has the right to determine its own future. Part of that determination of its own future may be, if this is what Ukraine wishes and other states involved agree, it may wish to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It may wish to join the European Union. Those are aspirations which Ukraine may very legitimately have because it wants to benefit from the membership of those organizations that it sees. Another part of this argument would be to say it's patently obvious, certainly this is what those organizations themselves would claim, it's very obvious that neither NATO nor the European Union are threatening to anybody. NATO is a defensive organization. The European Union isn't a military actor. And therefore, the claims that the claims that Russia makes about its security concerns are not really legitimate. They don't really have any grounding. We can see them largely as excuses for Russia's desire to try to dominate Ukrainian politics. If you accept the various points that I've made in that brief narrative, then the question that we come to ask ourselves, and particularly the question that a great power such as the United States has to ask itself, is what price are we willing to pay to defend the fundamental principles of the post-1945 world? What price are we willing to pay to defend our principles? And the consequence of that, of course, would be what price are we willing to pay to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and independence? So that's one way we might look at this particular crisis. An alternative narrative is what I'm referring to here, as I said earlier, as the power pragmatism narrative. And this places its focus not so much on Ukraine as on Russia. And this narrative would run something like this. Russia is a great power. As such, it has the right to expect other states, both fellow great powers and lesser powers, to respect its great power status. And part of recognizing that great power status would be to say that great powers live in a political world which is different to the world of other states. They live in a world in which they have to constantly focus upon the balance of power, both globally and regionally. And therefore, what everybody else in the world should have recognized, because it also recognized Russia as a great power, what everybody else should have recognized is that the eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the eastward expansion of the European Union, constituted a genuine and fundamental threat to Russia's security because it constituted a fundamental change in the distribution of power within Eastern Europe. If you buy into that line of argument, then you end up having to ask yourself a different fundamental question. Remember, the previous question on the principal narrative was, what price are we willing to pay to defend Ukraine? But on the power pragmatism narrative, the question's a different one. The question would fundamentally be, what price must Ukraine pay in order to satisfy and alleviate the great power concerns and interests of Russia? So we see two very different ways of thinking about this particular crisis in international politics. Are we focusing on the concerns of Ukraine and what we can do to assist it? Or should we be thinking about the legitimate, at least in terms of the power pragmatism narrative, the legitimate concerns of Russia? I'll give you another way quickly of thinking about the crisis in Ukraine. And this is using a framework developed by an incredibly eminent international relations theorist called Kenneth Waltz. You may be familiar with his work. Is dead now, but in his book, written in 1959, Man, the State and War, Waltz developed this idea of levels of analysis, how we can look at trying to understand politics by breaking it up into different levels of analysis. This has been picked up by huge numbers of other writers subsequently. Waltz had 3 levels of analysis. Some scholars have developed 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to use Waltz's original 3 levels. And they are effectively individual agency, the state level, and the international systemic level. And we can use each of these levels, so this is kind of a line of focus, to try to understand what's happening in the crisis in Ukraine. So the first one is the first image, the nature and behavior of man, as Waltz referred to it. He said, according to the first image of international relations, the locus of the important causes of war is found in the nature and behavior of man. Wars result from the selfishness, from the misdirected aggressive impulses, and from stupidity. Other factors are secondary and have to be interpreted in the light of these factors. A really crude rewriting of that phrase would be to say, is Putin the problem? Is President Putin, for example, as some have suggested, mad? Has he got some kind of messiah complex? Does he think he's a modern day Peter the Great? So is there something particular about President Putin that we need to think about in order to address the conflict in Ukraine? The second image is the internal organization of the state. So as Waltz says, the use of internal characteristics to explain external acts of the state, and this can take many forms. So is it about the type of government, the restrictions that are placed upon government in order to protect the prescribed rights of citizens, and so on? In other words, what we might want to ask ourselves is there something about Russia as a country? Is there something about its politics, about its political culture, about its legal system? Do we have to, in order to understand what's happening in Ukraine, do we need to understand the internal domestic politics as they operate within Russia? That would be a second image assessment. So you might, for example, say the fact that Russia doesn't have a genuinely functioning democracy. There's nobody to hold President Putin to account. The media can't do so. The courts can't do so. His parliament cannot do so. Is that what is at the heart of the problem in Ukraine? And my final image is the so-called third image, anarchy. Anarchy here doesn't, I should stress, mean chaos. It means, I'm using it back in that term I used earlier on as the opposition of hierarchy. And what says this? In anarchy, there is no automatic harmony because each state is the final judge of its own cause. Any state may at any time use force to implement its politics. Because any state may at any time use force, all states must constantly be ready either to counter force with force or to pay the costs of weakness. The requirements of state action are, in this view, imposed by the circumstances in which all states exist. So the point that Waltz is making here is that this isn't really about Putin. If you buy into this line of argument, it's not about Putin. It's not about Russia per se. It's about the distribution of power, the fact that the distribution of power is turning against Russia, and that any country which found itself, and any leadership which found itself in the position that Russia and President Putin does currently, any country would have reacted in the same way. One way to think about this, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, but this is a foreign policy doctrine that the United States has professed for well over 100 years now. And they say that they won't accept any incursion into the Western Hemisphere. Well, in many ways, what Russia has been trying to argue over Ukraine is that it's not accepting Western influence, Western incursions into its so-called sphere of influence. So this is a balance of power argument. So what I've tried to do with those three images is give you a kind of way of trying to think about what's happening in Ukraine. Is it all about President Putin? Is it all about the Russian state? Or is it really all about the global distribution of power? As is so often the case in politics, it's probably about all three. And it's about how these factors interact with one another. But I'm going to leave it there, and perhaps in any questions that people have, people will also be able to offer their views of what it is that is pushing or has pushed the conflict in Ukraine. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Justin. That was a really fascinating mini lecture, I guess we could call it, on current world politics. And I think it gives a really good insight to everyone who is watching, just the sort of breadth of things that students can expect to study when they come to study politics at the University of Hull. Now, I'm just going to share my own screen and we'll discuss a little bit more about the University of Hull itself. So you can see on our screen, we've got a few different politics courses that students can study at the University of Hull. We have a number of undergraduate bachelor courses, including BA Politics and BA Politics and International Relations. Now, I am a little bit biased because I actually studied BA Politics at the University of Hull. I graduated 6 years ago, so it is a little while ago, but I can really vouch for how good the course is. I really enjoyed it when it was here. It really set me up for looking at the world in an international sphere, and I guess that's how I've kind of got into international student recruitment now. But yes, we've got those two courses at an undergraduate level, and we've also got a couple of master's programs for politics. So you've got MA International Politics and MA Strategy and International Security. And again, you'll cover a breadth of things in these subjects. It can set you up for a range of careers. So later on, when you're thinking about what you want to do after you've graduated from the University of Hull, there are so many different areas that you can go into once you've got a degree with the University of Hull. Now, when you get here, we'll look at a undergraduate perspective. So what will you need to do to get to the University of Hull? So any students that are thinking of coming here for an undergraduate degree, you will need to study a foundation year before you come to the University of Hull. And we do provide those foundation years here on campus. These are provided by the Cambridge Education Group, and they're called an Undergraduate Foundation Year or Programme, so a UFP, provided by On Campus on Hull. There are entry requirements in terms of the English language requirements to study on one of our foundation programmes. It would be the equivalent of an IELTS 4.5 with no element less than a 4.0. Other requirements include what you would need to get in your secondary study. So you would need a upper secondary school year 2 of a GPA of 2.5 and an upper secondary school year 3 with a GPA of 2.0. Now, once you are on our course, you will study at the University of Hull's campus. So you'll get a really good feel for the university before you actually start your full-time undergraduate degree. And it means that you'll be able to get used to the city itself as well. We have on-campus accommodation that you can stay in for both your undergraduate programme and the foundation year. So if you feel comfortable in a certain accommodation, you can stay there. And yes, so the successful completion of the undergraduate foundation programme will enable you to join year 1 of BA Politics or BA Politics and International Relations. You can see there is a QR code on the screen there. If you want to scan that, that will just give you a little bit more information about the undergraduate foundation year that you can study at the University of Hull, and also the courses, what the modules you will study at in both your undergraduate year, foundation year, and during your full 3-year undergraduate degree. All of that information will be able to be found on that QR code. Now, I do know we have a number of master's students, so students who are interested in postgraduate study at the University of Hull in our politics school. Entry requirements to join our master's courses. Mostly, in terms of English language qualifications, you need an IELTS score of 6.5 or equivalent to other English language qualifications. And again, no element less than 5.5. For most courses, we do require an equivalent of a 2-2 degree. So that's a 2-2 undergraduate degree. We accept the Japanese 4-year degree as comparable to our bachelor degree. If you get 65% in your Japanese undergraduate degree, that is equal to a 2-2 at the University of Hull, so you'll be able to join us on most of our courses. But again, information about specific entry requirements for each of our courses can be found through that QR code that is currently available on screen. So if you'd like to find out more about what our MA International Politics or MS other master's programs that we've got, you can do that by scanning that QR code. It will give you all the information about different types of modules you can expect to study, and also how you will study at the University of Hull. Studying in the UK can be a little bit different to studying in other countries. There might be a lot more independent study than what you're currently used to. With that, you can check what modules you can study when you're studying at the University of Hull, and it will give you an idea of what is expected from you in terms of essays, exams, and things like that. At the University of Hull, we're really proud to have a fair and affordable tuition fee policy. Now, for students who are entering in the next academic year, so who are thinking of entering in September 2023, we are currently finalising our tuition fee policies for that year. We aim to have a fair and affordable tuition fee policies which will match as closely as possible to our UK fees. So that means that students who study at the University of Hull for postgraduate can expect to have a slightly lower tuition fee in comparison to other universities. And that is just because we like to have that international vision of everybody is entitled to study. It shouldn't matter where they come from. They shouldn't have to pay too much to study with us. Once our fees for the 23-24 academic year have been finalised, they will be available on our website. So please do keep checking back on our website to check what those fees will be. And yes, something to look forward to, definitely. Now I'm going to stop speaking there I'm going to hand on to Kaniko. Now, Kaniko is one of our international student ambassadors at the University of Hull. She is a postgraduate student, and she's currently studying AI and data science, and she's going to give us a really interesting overview of how she's found it as a Japanese student studying at the University of Hull. Now, I'll put myself on mute, and I will hand over to Kaniko. Thank you.
Thank you. こんにちは、皆さん。ハル大学の AI データサイエンスの修士コースで勉強してます、東邦子です。よろしくお願いします。本日は私のキャンパス内での生活だとか、休日はどのように過ごしているかなど、少しシェアできればと思います。よろしくお願いします。Alex, next slide, please. Yeah, the next slide, please. はい。じゃあ、まずは、勉強についてお話ししたいと思います。こちらの図は、私の1学期から2学期の間にですね、1週間でどんな風に勉強しているかっていうのをまとめたものになります。まず1週間ごとに、私のコースはですね、オンラインと現地実習のハイブリッドのコースになっていたので、まず1週間ごとの、1週間ごとにですね、オンラインで講義の方が配信されます。で、この講義には、その週の木曜日と金曜日のラボで行われるワークショップの内容っていうのが説明されます。で、講義を見た後ですね、予習して、ワークショップまでの間にですね、わからない内容を調べたり、質問したい内容をまとめたりとかしてます。で、木曜日、金曜日にワークショップに参加します。で、その中では、ディスカッションをしたりだとかですね、会話形式の講義だったり、あと実際に AI やデータサイエンスで利用するモデルのプログラミングをしたりして、テーマに対する理解を深めたりしてます。で、このワークショップは、ワークショップって言っても全く堅苦しいものとかではなくて、学生同士で話したり、教え合ったりもしますし、ティーチングアシスタントの方や、教授との距離もすごく近くって、わからないことがあったら、もうスッと手を挙げて聞けたりっていう感じです。で、私の場合はこのセッション通して、現地の学生さんとか、留学生の勉強友達もできたりして、で、よく一緒に図書館とかで勉強してました。で、こちらのワークショップが終わった後は、そのワークショップで終わりじゃなくて、オンラインでもサポートとかがあるので、そういったオンラインのフォローアップの、サポートとかも活用しながら復習をして、さらに理解を進めていく感じです。で、それと同時に、学期の初めに課題の発表があって、で、課題の提出は大体が学期の終わりに設定されているので、こちらも順次一緒に計画的に進めていく形になります。で、今はもう3学期なんですが、3学期は、担当教員の方の指導のもと、プロジェクトとして研究を行って、それを修士論文としてまとめて、かつ、プレゼンテーションを行うっていうところで、プレゼンテーションを作成しています。で、このプロジェクトは、1学期、2学期と少しずつ内容がどんどん深くなっていって、で、その集大成になるんで、とても大変なんですけど、やりがいがあって、面白いです。はい。Next slide, please. はい。で、次にちょっと生活についてです。で、私は今、大学の寮に住んでまして、写真3枚が実際に私の住んでいる寮になります。で、このウエストフィールドコートはとても新しくて、めちゃくちゃ綺麗です。で、私、こちらに留学するまで海外旅行はしたことあったんですけど、実際に海外で暮らすっていうのは初めてだったんで、ガス、電気、水道、インターネットがもうすでに使える状態になっていて、ベッドや家電なんかもついている量っていうのはとても ありがたかったです。で、慣れている方であれば大丈夫だと思うのですが、私が一人で全部やるとなると、大変だっただろうなと。で、おそらく時間かかってしまって、スムーズになんか勉強スタートできなかったんじゃないかなって思うぐらいです。で、また何かその寮のこととかで困ったことがあれば、24時間空いている寮の受付があるので、そこで対応してもらえるので、とっても便利です。で、イギリスにいてなんか怖いとか、そういったふうに感じたことはなくて、治安もいいんだろうなと思うんですけど、寮が大学の敷地内にあるので、なんか暮らしていて、なんかさらになんとなくもっと安心で安全な気がします。で、ラボやジムもありますし、レクチャールームとか図書館とかももちろん、同じキャンパス内にあるので近いですし、で、比較的安くて美味しい大学の食堂とかもあるので、とっても暮らしやすいなと思ってます。Next slide, please. で、こちらの写真は、春のキャンパスの、一部です。学校の校内、とっても緑が多くって綺麗です。で、モダンな建物っていうのもあるんですけど、私がイメージしていた、その、イギリスの伝統的な建物といった、こういった校舎もあって、とてもいい感じかなと思います。で、今年の初めにウォーキングアプリをインストールしたこともあってですね、勉強の間にキャンパスをウォーキングしたりしてます。で、随所でこういった観光地みたいな綺麗な景色も楽しむことができます。で、最近はやっとイギリスの方も日中は20度を超える日もあったりで、キャンパス内で半袖で過ごす日も出てきて、過ごしやすくもなってきてます。はい、next slide, please. で、最後に、週末や休暇についてです。で、私が一番最初に訪れた観光地は、春市の有名な観光地の一つであるディープっていう水族館でした。なかなか大きくて見応えのある水族館で面白かったです。で、また春聖堂だとか、リンカーン大聖堂、ダラム大聖堂などにも行ったりして、週末も勉強の間を縫って観光に出かけたりして楽しんでます。で、とても自然が豊かなので、なんか遠出しなくても、近くの小さな公園とかでも、湖や池があったりとかで、様々な鳥がいたりして、散歩するだけでもちょっと楽しめる感じかなとは思います。で、また、大学から、バスで10分か15分ぐらいで、大きなショッピングモールもあるので、そういったところにも行ったりして、なかなか便利かと思います。はい、で、以上が、私の大学での勉強から生活、休暇のお話です。で、私が今まで春大学で生活して思うのは、本当に学ぶのにとても良い環境が揃ってるなと思います。まず、一番、大事なことだと思うんですけど、不安や心配っていうのを感じたことがなくて、大学のスタッフの方や教授の方っていうのとものすごく距離が近いので、ちょっとした疑問とかも聞きやすいですし、必要な時には、必ずサポートを受けれたり、相談とかもできるので、なんか日々、大学ってもちろん勉強もするんですけど、留学するって生活も現地で行うので、大学が研究だけじゃなくて生活全般にもわたっても頼りになるのは本当にありがたいなと思ってます。なので今回ちょっとこのように皆さんにご紹介できてなんか嬉しいなと思ってます。はい。じゃあ以上となります。ありがとうございました。
Kiniko, thank you so much for that. And I think we've come to the end of our presentation now. So I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Myself, Dr. Justin Morris and Kiniko. We've really enjoyed presenting to you all today, and thank you to SI UK for having us as well. I think we're now handing over to Hiroshi, who may have some questions for us all. But if you do have any other questions after today's presentations, please don't hesitate to contact us questions, our email address is on screen there, global@hull.ac.uk. Please email us with anything. We'll be happy to answer you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really great, informative, presentation. Thank you very much. And はい、ありがとうございました。はい、それではですね、今からご質問のお時間に、なりますので、もしご質問がありましたら、チャットボックスの方にですね、お送りいただけたらと思いますので、よろしくお願いいたします。はい、今ですね、一つのご質問いただいておりますので、そちらについて、読み上げさせていただきたいと思います。Actually, we've got one question. I think this is going to be for Dr. Justin. So I'm going to send you the question through the chat box, and then I'm going to read out. There are generally two research methods related to international relations or politics. Yeah, and then so what is the future in how?
So we do empirical research. I think the distinction that would normally be made between the approach in the United States and the approach in the UK is that the American Academy tends to place far greater emphasis on quantification of data, so that they're interested in trying to develop structures which can in some way attach numerical values to particular political issues. And that's not something that you would find in the UK. The UK tends to adopt a far more what we would refer to as normative approach, where we're interested in arguing through the various issues, drawing on a whole set of other disciplines, so philosophy, ethics, history, etc. Whereas the United States is often referred to as having a very positivist approach. So as I say, much more kind of a numbers-based account. If you want a good example of what we're talking about here, compare to kind of leading international relations journals. If you look at something like International Affairs, which is one of the most prominent UK international relations journals, you will very, very rarely see big data sets or equations and so on and so forth. But if you look at something like International Organization, which is one of the top ranked American journals, sometimes, certainly from my perspective, it looks more like a mathematics journal than it does a politics journal. And that's reflecting the very different methodological approaches. So Hull, as a politics department, is very much immersed in that UK tradition of normative analysis and debate rather than quantification and positivist argument. So we're much more that traditional UK approach to politics rather than the way that the American Academy would look at things.
Okay, thank you very much. So if students join the international relations master's course, they can take like how to study like research, how to research method. Do you have a research method?
Yes, so we both the undergraduate and the postgraduate level, you will undertake research training as well as doing classes on the actual politics and the political issues that you're interested in. So obviously undergraduate level, that's not as advanced. We do a second year module, so halfway through the degree, which introduces a whole set of different approaches to conducting research, including more positivist and statistical approaches, although, as I say, they're not traditionally the way that most of our students would go. And then the students get to apply those in a final year dissertation or research project. And the same applies at the master's level. And then at the doctoral level, inevitably things are more advanced still. And so the university's doctoral college provides a whole set of training courses, some of which, or research training courses, some of which will involve very advanced positivists, so number crunching, to put it crudely, processes far beyond anything that I'm capable of. Maybe the kind of thing that Kuniko will know about, but certainly beyond my capabilities. So there is that opportunity to do a whole set of different research approaches, but certainly amongst the staff and for most of the students in the politics department, the approach would be more traditionally normative than it would be positivist.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. ありがとうございます。はい、他にご質問がありましたら、チャットボックスの方から、お願いいたします。そうですね、ちょっと東さんに、ご質問させていただきたいんですけれども、そうですね、日本から、イギリスに渡って、勉強していくということで、結構今の間で何を準備しておけばいいのかとか、結構不安に思っていらっしゃる方とかもいらっしゃるんですけれども、何かこれを行く前にしておいたらよかったなとか、あとは大学の方ですごく役に立ったサポートとかあれば、お伝えいただけたらと思うんですけれども、いかがですか？
そうですね。特にものすごい準備はっていうのは、私はあまり思い当たるものっていうのはあんまりないんですが、あと学校のサポートだと、結構そのスチューデントハブとかもそうですし、担当教官の方とかも、フェイス2フェイスで会ってお話がすぐ結構できるので、気軽にその先生の、部屋を訪ねて行って教えてもらうっていうことだったり、で、そういったサポートが、日々のサポートがいいのかなと。あとはその、寮とかでも、必ず誰かが、受付にいるので、生活面のなんかちょっと聞いたりっていうのも楽ですし、そうですね、なんか全体的なサポートというか、はい、はい、いいかと思います。
ありがとうございます。すごい先生との距離が近いっていうのはすごくなんか安心感が
そうですね。
ありますね。
なんかちょっとこんなこと聞いちゃっていいのかなっていうこともなんかどんどんずうずうしく聞いてもちゃんと答えてくれるので、
はい、
ありがたいです。
わかりました。ありがとうございます。はい。Okay, so Alex, can I ask you one question about job hunting? These days, we get a lot of questions from Japanese students about how to get a job in the UK or a support for finding a job. So, what kind of support do you offer in your university?
Absolutely, that's a really good question. So at the university, we have a dedicated student futures team. Our student futures team work with you right from the beginning of when you start your degree. So if in your mind, you've got a specific industry or job in mind that you'd like to go into, and you'd maybe like some job experience or anything like that during your actual degree, you can contact our student futures team who have connections both in the Hull area, in the national, the UK, and actually internationally as well. So they're able to find our current students job experience, work experience, placements, and things like that during their degree. And then also after you graduate, you can still use our Student Futures team, and you can use them throughout your life. So even if you've maybe gone to another country, 10 years after you've graduated, you can still contact our Student Futures team who can help you to find your dream job. Again, they've got really good connections all around the world. Locally as well, we've got a lot of industry locally. We're based in quite a large port in the UK, so there's lots of international opportunities with regards to that. But yes, there are plenty of opportunities, both while you're studying at the university, as we do offer, we've got a lot of part-time jobs available in the local area. If you're thinking you'd need something to just help you with money whilst you're here. So there's lots of opportunities for students to get work experience whilst they're at university. And we also offer really great support remotely as well if you are in a different country at the time to give you support, even if it's just you need help with a job interview and you'd like a practice. Our Student Futures team can give you that practice and go through potential questions you'll get. So yeah, absolutely. At the University of Hull, our Student Futures team are there to help you with any career questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yeah. はい、そうですね。就職のサポートもすごく手厚いようですし、はい、本当に、おすすめというか、すごくですね、さまざまなサポートがあるので、とても有意義な学生生活を送れるんじゃないかなとは思います。はい。そうですね。では、お時間が来て、しまいましたので、他にですね、ご質問も本日ないようですので、本日これで終了とさせていただきます。でもしですね、春大学に関して、ご質問等ありましたら、また弊社にご連絡いただけましたら、大学とつなぎさせていただくことも可能ですので、ぜひご連絡をいただけたらと思います。はい。それではですね、本日は皆様、お忙しいところお時間いただきましてありがとうございました。また何かありましたら、気軽に、ご連絡いただけたらと思います。はい。So, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much. So, bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Right.